The precise click of Marcus's keyboard keys was the loudest sound in his small, anemic apartment. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of late-afternoon sun piercing the grimy window, illuminating stacks of forgotten texts and an overflowing mug of cooled tea. He, a historian of obscure European cults and forgotten rituals, preferred the company of deceased scholars and crumbling manuscripts to living, breathing individuals. His current research, a dense analysis of medieval folk beliefs, offered a comfortable, predictable intellectual landscape. He valued the verifiable, the documented, the rational. Superstition was merely a fascinating societal phenomenon, a subject for dispassionate study, never in lived reality. A sharp rap on his apartment door, a sound as alien as a siren in a tomb, made him flinch. He rarely received visitors. The world beyond his door was a noisy, inconvenient distraction. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the sudden movement, and peered through the peephole. A tall, angular man in a charcoal suit stood on the landing, holding a slim leather briefcase. The solicitor. Marcus had been expecting him in a theoretical sense, ever since the terse official letter had arrived 3 weeks prior. The letter had spoken of an unexpected inheritance and a final will and testament, words that felt detached from his own quiet existence. He opened the door a crack. Marcus Thorne. It was a statement, not a question. Mr. Thorne, the solicitor affirmed, his voice dry as parchment. Mr. Alistair Finch, regarding the estate of Elias Blackwood. Marcus opened the door fully, allowing the man into the cramped space. The solicitor surveyed the apartment with an expressionless gaze, seemingly unfazed by the literary chaos. Please sit. Marcus gestured vaguely towards a precarious stack of books that served as a makeshift chair. The solicitor remained standing. My apologies for the intrusion, Mr. Thorne, Finch began, his words precise, clipped. But the matter is urgent. As you know from my correspondence, you are the sole inheritor of Blackwood Manor and its surrounding lands, following the rather sudden demise of your distant relative, Mr. Elias Blackwood, a rather remote branch of your family tree, I understand. Marcus nodded. He knew nothing of Elias Blackwood. The name was a blank slate. Remote is an understatement. I wasn't aware he existed. Indeed, the will specifies immediate transfer of all assets, including the manor itself. It is rather isolated, situated deep within the northern mountain range. The keys are here. Finch produced a heavy, ornate iron key from his briefcase, alongside a thick packet of legal documents. And a detailed map. The local authorities have already been informed of your ownership. There are certain local legends associated with the property. I advise you to disregard them. Superstition, nothing more. Marcus took the key. It felt cold, ancient, almost too heavy for its size. Legends? He asked, a flicker of professional curiosity overriding his inherent disinterest in anything beyond his research. Local folklore. Tales of the house changing things. Absorbing people. Utter nonsense, of course. The previous owner, Mr. Blackwood, was a recluse. His reclusiveness, combined with the manor's age and isolation, merely fueled the local imagination. Finch offered a thin, dismissive smile. Your signature on these documents and the property is legally yours. I've arranged for the utilities to be reconnected, but the house has been vacant for some time. The solicitor departed as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Marcus with the heavy key and a stack of papers detailing a legacy he neither sought nor understood. He reviewed the documents, the legal jargon washing over him, until one phrase caught his eye. Blackwood Manor, a property of significant historical interest. The words resonated with his determined, scholarly nature. A remote, ancient manor with a dark reputation. Perhaps it could offer a new, richer vein for his research, a more substantial setting than his dusty apartment. He would approach it with the same rigorous skepticism he applied to all his subjects. Local legends were just that, legends. 2 days later, Marcus navigated his aging sedan along the increasingly narrow, winding roads that snaked through the northern mountains. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain. He passed through the mountain pass, the road barely wide enough for his vehicle. Sheer rock faces rising on one side, a dizzying drop on the other. It was a place of stark, unforgiving beauty. A landscape that seemed to actively resist human encroachment. The map, a faded, hand-drawn thing, eventually led him down a barely discernible track, overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled limbs interlocking overhead, forming a perpetual twilight tunnel. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his tires and the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. He felt a prickle of unease, a sensation he attributed to the unfamiliarity of the terrain, the sheer isolation. Then, through a sudden break in the canopy, he saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not merely large, it was monolithic. The grounds were a tangled wilderness of overgrown shrubs and skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the facade. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, pressing in on him, heavy and suffocating. The air around the manor felt stagnant, thick with the scent of decay and something else he couldn't quite identify. A faint, metallic tang, perhaps. The house itself seemed to breathe, a colossal, dormant beast. He dismissed it, firm in his conviction. It was the isolation, the sheer age of the place, the local superstitions playing on his imagination. He was a rational man. He would approach this, as he approached all things, with a historian's objective eye. He gripped the heavy iron key. The manor was just a building, an artifact of the past, nothing more. The house waited. Blackwood Manor, a property of significant historical interest, though often accompanied by a rather unfortunate notoriety. The solicitor's precise, almost clinical delivery of the final phrase echoed in Marcus's mind. He had read it countless times in the past hour, the words a cold, formal premonition. He finally folded the document, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the dust-laden reality that awaited him. Marcus was a man of facts, of empirical evidence, and the notion of notoriety for a building struck him as a quaint provincial affectation. He had a manor to investigate, a family history to untangle, and no time for local fables. The journey to Blackwood Manor began the following morning, a deliberate act of detachment from the world he knew. His sturdy four-wheel drive chewed through the miles of asphalt, transitioning to gravel, then to a barely maintained track that clawed its way up a winding mountain pass. The air grew colder, thinner, the scent of pine needles and damp earth intensifying with every ascent. Jagged rock faces loomed, draped in moss, and the sky, once a pale blue, became a heavy, bruised gray. Below, the valley floor receded into a blur of green and brown, an increasingly distant memory. The isolation was profound, a physical weight that pressed against the vehicle's windows. Marcus, however, felt a surge of professional anticipation. This was precisely the kind of forgotten corner of the world where history lay undisturbed, waiting for his methodical dissection. The manor materialized abruptly from behind a thicket of ancient gnarled oaks, a monolithic silhouette against the bruised sky. There was no welcoming light, no sign of life. The heavy iron gate, rusted shut, required a significant effort to pry open, its shriek echoing across the deserted grounds. He drove through, the crunch of gravel under his tires the only sound, until he reached the overgrown forecourt. A wave of stale air, thick with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something indefinably old washed over him. He stepped into a cavernous entrance hall, its grandeur muted by decades of neglect. His first priority was to establish a workspace. It had a substantial desk, scarred and imposing, and a fireplace choked with ash. He began the arduous task of unloading his research materials, stacks of archival boxes, meticulously labeled binders, his laptop, and various recording devices. He set up his equipment with the efficient precision of a scholar preparing for a long siege. It was localized, confined to the space directly in front of him, as if he had stepped into a pocket of winter air. He paused, frowning, and scanned the heavy, mullioned windows for any visible cracks or gaps. None. He ran a hand along the stone wall. He shook his head, dismissing the sensation. The house was enormous. A thermal anomaly was hardly surprising. Hours later, deep into the organization, the late afternoon light fading into a dim twilight, Marcus was immersed in categorizing a collection of microfilmed parish records. He heard it then. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like distant voices conversing in a language he couldn't quite discern. He lifted his head, straining to hear. The sound was fleeting, a wisp of auditory illusion. He held his breath, listening intently, but there was only the creak of the old house settling and the distant sigh of the wind outside. He attributed it to the resonant acoustics of the empty rooms, or perhaps the wind whistling through a loose slate on the roof. His mind, accustomed to dissecting historical narratives, immediately sought logical explanations. He returned to his work, meticulously placing a heavy volume on a shelf he had just cleared. He turned to retrieve another from a box, his back to the shelf for only a moment. When he turned back, the book he had just placed was no longer flush with its companions. It had shifted, rotated slightly on its spine, its title now angled away from the others. Marcus stared at it, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He was certain he had aligned it perfectly. He must have nudged it, he concluded, perhaps with his elbow as he turned. His mind, fatigued from the journey and the effort of unpacking, was playing tricks. He pushed the book back into place with a decisive gesture. Later, while searching for a specific pen he was certain he'd placed on the desk's blotter, his hand brushed against a hidden compartment in the desk's side panel. It was a shallow, narrow drawer, almost invisible. Inside, nestled amongst a layer of fine dust, lay a stack of yellowed, brittle letters tied with a faded velvet ribbon and a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with elegant, looping script, faded but still legible. He opened the journal to a random page. My own thoughts are no longer my own. They echo with the voices of the departed, the lamentations of those who came before. Marcus scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. Poetic hyperbole, he muttered, turning another page. The structure demands. It hungers. It feeds on the very essence of memory, twisting truth into a grotesque tapestry of delusion. He paused, his brow furrowed. The language was melodramatic, certainly, but the intensity of the author's despair was palpable, even through the centuries. He flipped to the front, finding no name, only a date from the late 17th century. He placed the journal carefully beside the letters. Another piece of the manor's notoriety, he mused, a testament to the fragile minds of its past inhabitants, susceptible to the isolation and gloom of such a place. He was determined to understand the historical context of such delusions, to strip away the superstition and find the rational truth. The localized chill dissipated as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving Marcus's skin tingling with residual cold. He exhaled slowly, watching the faint plume of his breath vanish in the library's otherwise still air. It was a peculiar sensation, an anomaly he could not immediately dismiss as a draft. The old manor certainly had its share of structural eccentricities, but a sudden, contained pocket of frigid air defied simple architectural explanation. He considered checking the window for a crack or the fireplace for an updraft, but his rational mind offered no satisfying immediate answer. He merely returned to the stack of fragile texts, his focus fractionally disrupted. Later that afternoon, as the slanting light through the tall windows began to fade, a new phenomenon began. Marcus paused his meticulous note-taking, straining his ears. It was not a distinct voice, merely a low, sibilant rustling, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or perhaps the indistinct murmur of conversation heard through several layers of heavy fabric. He attributed it to the house settling, the old timbers contracting in the cooling air, or the wind sighing through ill-fitted window frames. He dismissed it, but the sound persisted, a subtle, almost subliminal presence that he found himself unconsciously filtering out. Each time, he would snap his head around, only to find nothing but the familiar, dust-laden furniture, bathed in the encroaching twilight. He blamed fatigue, the strain of deciphering faded script, or the unreliable nature of peripheral sight. His eyes were tired, undoubtedly. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache beginning to throb behind his eyes. Sleep offered no respite. The nights became a fragmented tapestry of vivid, unsettling dreams. He recalled vast, echoing spaces, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, and a relentless, suffocating pressure. He would wake with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of ash in his mouth. He woke feeling unrested, his mind clouded, the sharp edges of his determination dulled by the ceaseless assault on his subconscious. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Marcus plunged deeper into the manor's extensive archives. He sought patterns, a historical context for the unsettling atmosphere that now permeated his days and nights. He sifted through faded ledgers, brittle journals, and bundles of letters tied with decaying ribbon. The sheer volume of material was daunting, but his historian's instinct, sharpened by a burgeoning unease, guided him. He discovered that the manor had a disturbing history of its inhabitants suffering from melancholy, nervous conditions, or fits of delusion. He found a series of letters from an 18th century resident, declared lost to the mountain pass, his disappearance a local legend. Another set of documents detailed the life of a reclusive scholar in the late 19th century, who after years of isolated study within the manor's walls, meticulously catalogued his own descent into what he termed the Great Unraveling. His journal entries described a growing inability to distinguish his own thoughts from those that seemed to seep from the very structure of the house. He wrote of constant phantom footsteps, of objects subtly shifting when he wasn't looking. Marcus noted the recurring theme: prolonged isolation within the manor. The mountain pass that cut off the estate from the nearest village for weeks during heavy snowfalls had contributed to the solitude of many residents. He found records of several other disappearances, suicides, and instances of severe mental deterioration, all linked to individuals who had spent extended periods alone in the house. The pattern was too consistent, too specific, to be mere coincidence. His rational mind, however, fought against the implications. There had to be a logical explanation, perhaps a hereditary mental illness among the families who owned the manor, or a structural flaw that released harmful gases. As the late afternoon light streamed through the library windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air, Marcus found himself reading a fragment of a journal from the early 20th century. It was a single drawn-out syllable, like a breath held too long, then released. Mine. He flinched, dropping the fragile page. His breath caught in his throat. He spun around, his eyes darting frantically across the empty room. There was nothing. The faint vibration, a deep hum beneath the floorboards, intensified. Marcus stood frozen, the dropped page of the journal lying at his feet like a discarded feather. He scanned the study, his gaze sweeping over the towering bookshelves, the heavy oak desk, the cold hearth. Nothing stirred. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and dormant dust, remained still. He told himself it was the house settling, the groaning of ancient timbers, a trick of the mind in the oppressive silence. Yet the tremor persisted, a low thrum that seemed to originate not from the structure, but from within him, a sympathetic resonance with something vast and unseen. He bent to retrieve the page, his fingers brushing the cool, rough paper. It felt brittle, almost alive. He tried to focus on the faded script, on the meticulous account of a minor legal dispute from the late 17th century, but his concentration splintered. He turned abruptly, his neck muscles taut, but the room was empty, as always. Later that evening, as he prepared a meager meal in the cavernous, underused kitchen, the first vision struck. He was stirring a pot of soup when the clatter of metal on stone echoed, not from his spoon, but from somewhere else. Somewhere then. The kitchen around him blurred, the modern stove fading, replaced by a massive, soot-blackened hearth. He smelled wood smoke, rendered fat, and something acrid, like fear. The scene lasted only a breath, a disorienting flash before the kitchen solidified back to its present, silent state. Marcus gripped the countertop, his knuckles white. Fatigue, he reasoned. The stress of the move, the unfamiliar surroundings. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. But the incidents grew in frequency and vividness. While examining a tapestry in the west drawing room, a tapestry depicting a hunting scene, the woven threads seemed to part. He found himself not in the drawing room, but on a wind-swept mountain pass, the air thin and sharp in his lungs. He heard the creak of leather, the snorting of horses, the muffled jingle of bridles. A carriage, heavy and black, struggled up the treacherous, narrow path, its wheels grinding against loose shale. He saw the driver, a hunched figure battling the reins, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The scent of pine needles and damp earth was overpowering. The scene dissolved, leaving Marcus swaying, his hand pressed against the rough wool of the tapestry, the drawing room unnervingly still around him. He believed in what he could touch, measure, verify. But the visions were too sharp, too detailed, too real. He began to question the integrity of his own perception. The unseen presence became a constant companion. It was not malevolent in an active sense, not yet, but it was profoundly invasive. Like 1,000 unseen eyes scrutinizing his every move, sifting through his thoughts. He felt judged, observed, as if his very essence was being weighed, analyzed. One afternoon, in the library, he discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves and dust, was a small, leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age. The script was elegant but frantic, detailing the slow descent of a past inhabitant into despair. A faint, low moan, like wind through a cracked window pane, resonated from the very bookshelves. It was a memory, a feeling, seeping from the walls, from the diary, from the very air. He saw, superimposed over the library's familiar shelves, a fleeting image of a man, gaunt and wild-eyed, staring into the middle distance, his mouth open in a silent scream. Marcus felt an intense, crushing pressure on his chest, as if the entire weight of the house, of its accumulated memories and suffering, was pressing down upon him. His carefully constructed skepticism, his logical defenses, fractured under the onslaught. He was no longer just observing the house. He was becoming part of its grim tapestry. The profound sense of despair, a crushing weight that was not his own, lingered in the library air. It settled on Marcus like a fine, invisible dust, coating his resolve. He stood amidst the shadowed shelves, the low moan now a barely perceptible thrum beneath his feet, a vibration through the thick floorboards. He told himself it was the house settling, the wind finding a new crevice. But the explanation felt hollow, insufficient. The despair was a distinct presence, an emotion he had merely walked into, a garment left behind by a previous wearer. Days dissolved into a hazy sequence. The desire to leave, initially a sharp, insistent urge, began to dull. He would find himself staring out the tall, grimy windows at the distant gray line of the horizon, a path to the world beyond, and the thought of traversing it felt like an immense, unnecessary effort. One morning, a rare burst of clarity pierced the haze. He needed supplies. He needed to leave. The conviction felt fragile, an old memory attempting to resurface. He reached the base of the mountain pass, the narrow road snaking upwards, disappearing into a curtain of mist. Above him, the craggy peaks loomed, indistinct and menacing in the low cloud cover. The pass itself seemed to breathe, a silent, formidable barrier. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. A profound weariness settled over him, deeper than physical fatigue. The thought of navigating those treacherous curves, of facing the sheer drops and the relentless, isolating expanse, felt utterly draining. It was not just the road. It was the idea of leaving, of severing the growing connection he felt to the manor. The mountain pass was not merely a physical obstruction. It was a psychological wall, erected by an unseen hand. With a sigh that felt less like resignation and more like an exhale of relief, he turned the car around. Back within the manor's walls, the attempts to contact the outside world became increasingly futile. He tried his mobile phone, its battery indicator perpetually low, even after hours on the charger. Emails to a colleague, detailing his initial findings and growing unease, bounced back with error messages he couldn't decipher. The internet connection, once sporadic, now refused to connect at all. It was not just a lack of signal. It was an active rejection, a digital barrier mirroring the physical one of the mountain pass. The world outside had ceased to respond. Or perhaps the manor simply wasn't letting his messages out. He ceased to care about his appearance. His beard grew unruly. His clothes became a rotated selection of the same few stained shirts and trousers. Meals were forgotten, or consisted of stale biscuits found in a forgotten pantry. The manor had begun to define his existence. The faint creaks and groans, once unsettling, were now the house's breathing, its living presence. It demanded nothing of him, only his presence, his attention. Yet this comfort was a deceptive thing. He felt his energy draining, not quickly, but steadily, like water seeping from a cracked cistern. His thoughts, once sharp and analytical, became sluggish, easily diverted. The determination that had brought him to the manor, the scholarly drive that defined him, softened, faded. He would spend hours simply sitting, staring at a patch of peeling wallpaper or tracing the intricate patterns of a dusty rug. He was becoming less Marcus and more an extension of the manor itself, a new fixture in its ancient, hungry architecture. He stood amidst the shadowed shelves, the low moan now a barely perceptible thrum beneath his feet, a vibration through the thick oak floorboards that resonated in his sternum. This was his house, his library. These were his hands. Yet a disquieting whisper suggested otherwise. He turned, intending to retrace his steps to the grand hall, to the familiar weight of the front door, to the faint promise of the world outside. The corridor, however, was not where he remembered leaving it. A new archway, previously unnoticed, now opened into a narrower passage, shrouded in a deeper gloom. His brow furrowed. He was meticulous, observant. He knew the layout of this wing. This was wrong. He walked towards the new passage, his boots silent on the threadbare runner. He ran a hand along the wall, the wood smooth and cool beneath his fingertips, but an undercurrent of rough, irregular stone seemed to hum beneath the surface. No, not empty. It was filled with a swirling gray mist that coiled around his ankles, obscuring the floor. He could taste the mist, a faint mineral taste on his tongue, and it carried with it the distinct smell of wet earth and pine. Through the swirling vapor, he saw a distant, towering silhouette, a jagged peak. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through the haze in his mind. He was not in the manor. Below, a treacherous path snaked down, barely visible through the swirling snow. He had to cross the mountain pass. The urgency was immediate, absolute. He remembered the biting wind, the sheer drop, the desperate need to reach the other side before nightfall. The floor felt uneven, rocky. He reached out, expecting to feel the rough face of a cliff, but his hand met solid, polished wood. The mist dissipated as quickly as it had formed, revealing a long, unlit gallery, lined with portraits he had never seen before. Faces stared out from the canvases, severe and unsmiling, their eyes following him with an unnerving intensity. A tremor ran through him. Why Elias? He was Marcus. He stumbled back, the sudden shift jarring his perception of reality. The mountain pass, the icy wind, the sense of impending doom. It had been so real. He pressed his palms against his eyes, willing the sensation away. When he opened them, the gallery remained, the portrait still watching. He stared at the central figure, the man with the desperate eyes. A strange, insistent thought took root. This was his gallery. He had commissioned these paintings. He remembered the arguments with the artists, the precise shade of crimson he had demanded for the drapery. He was a historian. He had inherited this house. He did not commission portraits of dour ancestors. He did not remember a mountain pass. Yet the memories felt utterly authentic, more vivid than his own recent past. He tried to recall his arrival at the manor, the taxi ride, the conversation with the estate agent. The details were hazy, indistinct, like trying to grasp smoke. He burst through a door only to find himself in a room he knew to be the master bedroom, except the furniture was different, heavier, older. A four-poster bed draped in faded velvet stood where his own modern bed should have been. A heavy oak desk, scarred and ink-stained, replaced his sparse writing table. On the desk, a leather-bound journal lay open. His gaze fell upon the elegant, spidery script. "The labyrinth deepens," it read. "Each turn a betrayal of memory. I saw myself in the looking glass today, and for a moment, it was not my own face reflected there, but that of a stranger. A young man, full of an earnest academic zeal. He believes he can unravel the threads of this place. Poor fool." The journal felt familiar in his hands, the weight, the texture of the aged leather. He knew that script. He knew those thoughts. It was his despair. He was Elias. He was the man trapped in the portraits, and the earnest young academic fool. That was Marcus. The lines blurred, then dissolved entirely. He was both. He was neither. The house had woven him into its fabric, a new thread in its endless, consuming tapestry. The aged leather journal felt cool against Marcus's clammy fingers, yet a profound, internal chill had already settled deep within his bones. The looping, precise script, the peculiar phrasing, the very cadence of the thoughts recorded on the brittle pages. It was undeniably his. A terrifying, anachronistic echo. He traced a line, an observation about the manor's oppressive silence, and heard his own voice articulate the identical thought just yesterday. Despair, a crushing, suffocating weight, pressed in from all sides, far deeper and more existential than any he had ever known. He slammed the journal shut, the sound a sharp crack in the otherwise heavy stillness of the library. His breath hitched, a ragged, shallow intake of air. This was impossible. A delusion. He needed fresh air, an anchor to a reality that felt increasingly distant. He pushed himself from the heavy carved chair, his legs stiff, muscles protesting with an unfamiliar ache. He stumbled, catching himself on a nearby table, his palms scraping against the rough, dusty wood. The faint scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like dried blood and decaying roses, filled his nostrils, clinging to the dry air. As he steadied himself, a new sensation rippled through him. He was suddenly, utterly present on a high, exposed ridge. The wind, bitter and raw, tore at his clothes, whipping strands of hair across his face. Below, a dizzying drop into a chasm shrouded in mist. The air tasted of ice and stone. The sky above was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening snow. He was on a mountain pass, the narrow track treacherous with loose scree, the precipice a constant looming threat to his left. A desperate urgency pulsed through him. A need to escape, to descend, to find shelter before the storm broke. Marcus blinked, the library walls slowly solidifying around him. He was still in the manor, the heavy, musty air still thick around him. But the vividness of the mountain pass, the sheer sensory detail, was unlike any mere daydream. It felt ingested, like a memory, not his, but one he had momentarily absorbed, or perhaps one that had been fed to him. The journal, the recurring patterns, the profound exhaustion that stole his waking hours and haunted his sleep. The subtle shifts in the manor's architecture, the way a certain corridor felt longer, a window seemed to move, a door appeared where there had been none before. It wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just a place of lingering specters. The manor was alive, not in any conventional sense, not with beating pulse or conscious thought, but as a vast predatory organism. It fed. It drew sustenance from the very essence of its inhabitants. Not just their fear, but their memories, their sanity, their vitality. It consumed them slowly, subtly, until their lives, their identities, became indistinguishable from its own ancient, malevolent history. He remembered the feeling of being drained, the way the house seemed to grow stronger, heavier, more present as his own energy waned. He walked to the window, his movements stiff and deliberate, as if his limbs were filled with sand. The manor wasn't just in his mind. It was actively shaping it, blurring the edges of his reality, weaving its tapestry of sorrow and despair through his own consciousness. The mountain pass memory, he realized with a sickening lurch, had been a fragment, a taste of another life, another victim, absorbed and regurgitated. He was its current meal. He was not just living in the manor, he was being digested by it. His memories were being siphoned, his thoughts twisted, his very life force slowly leached away. He was reading his own epitaph, penned by countless hands, yet ultimately by his own. He was being erased, replaced by the house itself, a determined spark. He was Marcus. This was illogical, unreasonable, monstrous, but it was happening. And if it was happening, there had to be a way to fight it. He would not simply become another entry in the journal, another forgotten memory for the house to feast upon. He gripped the window frame, knuckles white. He would fight. A terrifying, anachronistic echo. He read the last entry again, the words shimmering on the page as if written through a heat haze. The consumption begins. It wears my face, speaks my words. The outside world recedes, but the core remains. Seek the severance. Severance. The word resonated with an impossible clarity, cutting through the encroaching fog that had become his constant companion. This wasn't merely a record of another victim. It was a desperate message, a warning from a future self, or a past self, or a self that existed simultaneously in the house's temporal distortion. He wasn't just losing his mind. He was being rewritten. The house was not just a place. It was a predator, devouring identities, weaving them into its own fabric. And something within him, a stubborn, terrified spark, refused to yield. A low groan emanated from the floorboards above, a sound like ancient timbers shifting under immense, unseen pressure. It was the house, a living entity, aware of his burgeoning lucidity, his brief, desperate resistance. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in the corners of the study, writhing as if alive, reaching for him. Marcus clutched the journal, his knuckles white. He would fight. His gaze swept the room, searching for anything, a clue, a forgotten detail. The house had been subtly guiding him, feeding him information. Yes, but always in service of its own agenda, Now he needed to find what it sought to conceal. He remembered the architect's sketches, the strange symbols etched into the fireplace in the great hall, the peculiar stone in the cellar. These weren't mere eccentricities. They were components of a system. He rose, his legs stiff, and moved towards the shelves that lined the study. His fingers traced the spines of forgotten tomes, leather cracked and brittle. History, philosophy, obscure natural sciences, all collected by previous inhabitants, all consumed. He needed something else, something outside the house's curated narrative. It was the house's pulse, quickening with anger. It knows. He remembered a fleeting passage in an old parish record mentioning a warden's stone and a ritual of binding performed by the original builder, a reclusive stonemason known for his peculiar beliefs. The location was vague, where the 3 peaks meet the sky beyond the winding path. He pushed past volumes on heraldry and ancient languages, his eyes scanning for anything related to local folklore or forgotten rites. He pulled it out. It was a rolled parchment, tied with a dried leather thong. The parchment itself felt oddly warm, almost alive, despite its age. They depicted the manor, but superimposed over it were lines of force, currents, and strange angular symbols he didn't recognize. At the center of the diagram, where the heart of the manor would be, a single word was inscribed in a language he vaguely recognized as Old Norse, Igur. Below it, a short, stark instruction, translated roughly in a smaller, later hand. To sever the root, one must speak the name at the pass of the silent peaks, holding the heart of the earth. The pass of the silent peaks. He knew that name. It was the colloquial term for the treacherous mountain pass that wound through the jagged peaks flanking the valley, miles from the manor. A place known for its desolate beauty and sudden violent storms. And the heart of the earth? What could that mean? The house wasn't merely consuming memories. It was drawing energy from a specific source, a root that extended deep into the earth, anchoring it. The diagram showed that this root was vulnerable, not within the manor itself, but at a specific point, a nexus of natural energy located in that remote mountain pass. The house had been built over something, a conduit, and its architect had known how to contain or amplify it, and perhaps how to sever it. The parchment, however, didn't specify what the heart of the earth was, or how one was to speak the name Igur at the pass. It was a piece of a puzzle, a terrifyingly incomplete instruction. But it was a lead. It was a chink in the house's armor. The house responded with a sudden, violent shudder. A gust of frigid wind ripped through the study, though the windows remained shut. Books toppled from shelves, scattering across the floor with dull thuds. The air crackled with a palpable, malevolent energy. A low, guttural growl echoed from the walls themselves, a sound of ancient, boundless fury. It knew he had found something. It knew he was trying to break free. Marcus gripped the parchment, his mind racing. But the glimmer of resistance, fragile as it was, now burned with a desperate, terrifying resolve. He had a weapon, or at least the blueprint for one. He just didn't know how to wield it, or if he would survive the attempt. Marcus stood in the library, the cryptic journal entry still burning in his mind. The mountain pass. A specific, tangible location. Not just some ethereal concept. He had dismissed so much, categorized it as historical anomaly, psychological strain, a trick of the light. But this. A surge of grim determination coursed through him, momentarily eclipsing the gnawing dread. He would find a way to reach that pass, to understand its connection to the manor. He turned, the old floorboards groaning under his weight, a sound that no longer felt benign. The house had shifted. He felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air pressure, a new weight in the silence. He started towards the main hall, intending to consult the local maps he'd brought to pinpoint the exact route to the pass. As he reached the library door, the heavy oak panel swung inward with a deliberate, slow creak, then slammed shut with a concussive force that rattled the glass in the nearby display cabinets. It wasn't the wind. The air was still. He pushed against the door. It was locked. Not just latched, but bolted, as if an unseen hand had thrown the deadbolt. He tried the handle again, twisting, rattling. Nothing. This was no longer a house playing tricks. He was not just trapped in the house. He was trapped by it. He moved to the window, a narrow leaded pane looking out onto a neglected garden. Too high, too small. He was on the second floor. He searched for another exit, his gaze sweeping the shelves, the fireplace. There was none. He wasn't just observing the manor's malevolence anymore. He was experiencing its deliberate, focused malice. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a discordant murmur, a chorus of hushed, ancient voices, all speaking at once, yet none discernible. He spun around, his eyes darting into the dim corners, only the dust and the looming presence of forgotten tomes. He tried the door again, his shoulders slamming against the unyielding wood. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, like old iron left out in the rain. He heard a scratching sound, faint but insistent, from inside the walls. Not mice. Something larger, more deliberate. Suddenly, a section of the wall beside the fireplace, previously solid and plastered, seemed to ripple, its surface blurring as if viewed through heat haze. It reached out a skeletal hand, not quite touching the surface of the wall, but its presence was enough. A wave of profound despair washed over Marcus, a sudden debilitating grief that felt alien, not his own. The entity was projecting emotions, not just imagery. He stumbled back, his mind screaming in protest. This was beyond anything he had conceived. The house wasn't just showing him echoes, it was inflicting them. Marcus found a heavy brass fire poker, its weight comforting in his trembling hand. Not yet. He scanned the room, searching for anything, any weakness, any way out. His gaze fell on a large, intricately carved wooden cabinet against the far wall, one he hadn't paid much attention to before. It seemed out of place, slightly newer than the other furnishings. He approached it cautiously, the scratching in the walls growing louder, closer. He ran his hands along the cabinet's surface, feeling for a seam, a latch. His fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible button disguised as part of the carving. He pressed it. With a deep, resonant click, the cabinet swung inward, revealing a narrow, dust-choked passage, descending into absolute blackness. It was a passage designed for escape, for secrecy, a way out, or a deeper trap. He hesitated for only a moment. The library, with its slammed door and spectral tormentor, was no longer an option. The house was fighting, actively trying to keep him contained, to consume him. The air thrummed with a malevolent energy, a promise of further struggles, further horrors. He was not just exploring a house. He was battling an entity, and it was just beginning to truly bare its teeth. The journal entry had been a spark, igniting a desperate clarity in Marcus. The mountain pass. A phrase that had previously seemed a poetic metaphor now resonated with a chilling specificity. He no longer questioned the house's sentience, its malevolence. He understood it as a vast, predatory consciousness, and the pass, he theorized, was its mouth, its core, its point of vulnerability. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden, urgent need for action. His plan, conceived in fragmented flashes of insight from the journals and his own besieged mind, felt both mad and undeniably correct. He had studied the cryptic etchings, the recurring symbols of closure and severance. He believed he knew what he had to do, and where. The house, as if sensing his intent, began to subtly shift. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards beneath his worn boots. He ignored them, focusing on the coordinates, the directions implied by the journal's final, desperate scrawls. The polished wood of the banister felt slick beneath his palm. The tapestries on the walls, depicting forgotten hunts and stoic ancestors, seemed to ripple, the figure's eyes following him. He pushed through a heavy oak door that usually led to a storage antechamber. This time, however, the space beyond was subtly different. A narrow passage, previously unseen, now yawned before him. It was a vertical slit in the stone, barely wide enough for his shoulders, leading down into absolute blackness. No torchlight, no lamp, no flicker of memory suggested its previous existence. This was it. The house had opened for him. Or perhaps it was luring him. He descended. The stone walls pressed in, rough against his coat. The air grew frigid, biting at his exposed skin. The descent was steeper than it looked, a series of uneven steps carved into the rock. Turn back. You don't belong here. It will consume you. Marcus pressed on, his jaw clenched. He recognized the house's tactics. These were the memories, the identities of those it had consumed, now weaponized against him. The passage abruptly widened, then opened into a vast, cavernous space. Marcus stumbled forward, his breath catching in his throat. This was the mountain pass. It was not outside, not under an open sky, but it possessed all the terrifying grandeur of a primordial landscape. A bitter wind, carrying the scent of ozone and ancient ice, whipped through the cavern, tearing at his clothes. The floor was uneven, covered in a fine crystalline dust that crunched underfoot. In the center of this impossible subterranean pass stood a towering monolithic structure of obsidian-like rock. It pulsed with the same sickly green light that permeated the cavern. As Marcus drew closer, the light intensified, and he saw it. Within the rock, not carved, but embedded and flowing, were countless shimmering threads of light. Each thread was a memory, a thought, an echo of a life. This was the house's true form, its feeding apparatus. It consumed not flesh, but consciousness, distilling it into this raw, vibrant energy. A low thrum vibrated from the monolith, growing in intensity, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his bones. It was the house's consciousness, its hunger, its ancient, malevolent will. It was the collective anguish of every soul absorbed, and it sought to overwhelm him, to make him surrender. Marcus fought against the psychological assault, gripping the small, intricately carved wooden box he had brought from the library. He scattered the minerals in a rough circle around himself, then held the root aloft, a fragile, gnarled stick against the terrifying grandeur of the monolith. The moment he began to chant the guttural, ancient words from the journal, the cavern erupted. The wind became a shriek, a physical force that tore at him. The monolith pulsed with a furious red glow, and the shimmering threads within it writhed like ensnared serpents. The ground beneath him vibrated, and fissures spiderwebbed across the obsidian surface of the monolith, like cracks in a monstrous living eye. His own memories, vivid and painful, flooded his mind. The quiet joy of a childhood afternoon, the sharp grief of loss, the intellectual thrill of discovery. The house was trying to consume him, to strip him bare, to assimilate his very being into its terrible core. He screamed the final words of the incantation, his voice raw, barely audible over the howling wind and the roaring fury of the house. He thrust the dried root forward, aiming it at the heart of the convulsing monolith. This was the climax of his struggle, the final, desperate confrontation for his mind, his identity, and his very life. The cavern roared, and Marcus felt himself being pulled, violently, towards the pulsing, hungry stone. The cold, rough rock against Marcus's palm was a lifeline, a physical anchor in the swirling chaos. The house pressed in, no longer content with mere whispers or fleeting apparitions. It projected entire lifetimes into his mind, memories not his own, yet so vivid they threatened to overwrite his own history. He saw a child's toy, a wooden soldier splintering on a flagstone floor. He felt the crushing despair of a lover's betrayal, sharp as a shard of ice. He tasted the metallic tang of fear in a stranger's mouth. These were not ghosts. They were echoes, reverberations of consciousnesses the house had consumed, now marshaled against him. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the rhythmic thud of his own heart, a drumbeat against the house's discordant symphony. He knew its game. It wanted to dissolve him, to add his essence to its vast internal archive. But he was Marcus, a historian, a man of facts and evidence, and he would not become another forgotten entry in its catalog of souls. A sudden sharp crack echoed from somewhere deep within the walls, not a memory, but a physical sound. His resistance, his refusal to yield, was a wound. This realization ignited a desperate, furious resolve. If he could wound it, he could escape it. He pushed off the wall, his muscles screaming in protest. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of unseen presences, like hands pressing against his skin. He moved, not towards the main entrance, but deeper, towards the manor's oldest, most neglected section, a place where the air always felt thin and brittle, where the house's hold seemed weakest. He remembered a crumbling, forgotten passageway mentioned in a dusty journal, a service route for a long-dead groundskeeper, leading away from the main structure. Visions flickered across his eyes, his own face, distorted and aged, staring back from a tarnished mirror, his voice echoing with words he had never spoken. He saw himself, a broken man, wandering endless identical corridors, his mind a sieve. This was the threat, the ultimate absorption. He stumbled through a collapsed doorway, showering himself in dust and splinters. He clawed his way through a narrow, winding passage, the walls slick with condensation, the ceiling barely clearing his head. The groaning grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was tearing at its seams. He scrambled upwards, his fingers finding purchase on jagged rock edges, his lungs burning. The house screamed in his mind, a voiceless shriek of loss and fury. It was losing him. He pulled himself through the narrow opening, gasping, collapsing onto a patch of coarse, wet grass. The air hit him, sharp and bracing, smelling of pine and cold stone. Above him, the sky was a bruised, gray expanse. He pushed himself to his knees, blinking, his vision still swimming with residual images. It looked different from this vantage point, less a collection of stones and timbers, and more an organic, living thing, its various wings and turrets like limbs reaching into the sky, its foundations seeming to meld directly into the bedrock. A profound silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind. The psychic assault had ceased. He was free. Or was he? He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, not just from exertion, but from something deeper. He felt. His memories were there, intact, but they felt distant, as if viewed through a pane of frosted glass. He had escaped, but not unscathed. It pulsed once, a slow, deliberate beat, and then receded. The house was not dead. It was merely wounded, quiescent, perhaps waiting. He stood on the mountain pass, the biting wind tearing at his clothes. He was Marcus, yes, but a Marcus reshaped, carved by an ordeal that had reached into the deepest chambers of his mind. He had escaped absorption, but a part of him, an unquantifiable sliver, felt irrevocably bound to the malevolent entity below. The question of absorption or escape no longer felt like a simple binary.